A pleasant good evening, everyone. Hello, are you there? There you go. I'm delighted to welcome you here to the University of the Bahamas' North Color Class and Colonialism. I've been saying, I'm trying to say this word all day. Anyway, thank you for coming. And for those of you who have traveled, whether you traveled by boat, train, plane, car to get here, we thank you so much for being here today. And for some of you who are back home, welcome back to the Second City. We have invited a number of scholars and artists and creatives and thinkers to convene all in one space. And as we celebrate the 50th year of Bahamian independence and reflect on the national journey. So it is my honor for me to welcome all of you here in attendance. We want to specifically look and remember those of you who are here from our Grand Bahama community, our UB North friends and partners, the presenters and participants of the conference, our leadership here, our campus president, Dr. Ian Strawn, our vice president, Dr. Maria Woodside Oriaki, and of course, our UB faculty, staff, ladies and gentlemen, a pleasant good evening to you. Now, at this time, I want to invite you to please rise for the singing of the national anthem of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. And this will be followed by the invocation by Dr. Veronica Ferguson, our associate professor here at the School of Education at UB North.
Good evening. Let us bow. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your blessings on us. We thank you, Heavenly Father, for this day. We thank you, Father, for the opportunity to come together in intellectual discourse. Lord, we pray your blessings on these proceedings. We pray your blessings on our ideas, our thoughts, our plans. And Father, we pray that these ideas, thoughts, and plans would be in line with your purpose for our lives, individually and collectively as a nation. We thank you, Lord, for the institution called the University of the Bahamas. We pray, Heavenly Father, that all that we say and do would to make it a better academic institution. We pray for the Bahamas. After 50 years, we thank you, Lord, for your faithfulness. We thank you for your goodness. And as we debate, we discuss, we grow, we learn, Heavenly Father, help us to make this little country a better place. In the name of Jesus, thank you.
Please be seated. Distinguished guests, family members, participants, ladies and gentlemen, please warmly welcome my boss, Dr. Ian Strawn, the university's Executive Vice President, Campus President of UB North, and Conference Chairman, to the podium as he delivers the welcome remarks.
I come from the nigger yard of yesterday, leaping from the oppressor's hate and the scorn of myself, from the agony of the dark hut in the shadow and the hurt of things, from the long days of cruelty and the long nights of pain, down the wide streets of tomorrow, of the next day, leaping I come, who cannot see will hear. In the nigger yard I was naked like the newborn, naked like a stone or a star. It was a cradle of blind days rocking in time, torn like the skin from the back of a slave. It was an aching floor on which I crept on my hands and my knees, searching the dust for the trace of a root, or the mark of a leaf, or the shape of a flower. I want to welcome you, ladies and gentlemen, to this conference. I share there some of the poetry of Martin Carter, Guyanese poet, which I felt was an appropriate way to convene as we come here to commemorate and reflect on 50 years of nationhood. I am certainly humbled and grateful by all of those who have come from far and further away, and some not so far, to meet, to discuss, to talk about this place that we love and what it can be for us in the next 50 years. So I welcome you. I know this is going to be stimulating and inspiring, and for some of us, a reunion of sorts, because some of the people here I've known for a very, very long time, and it's always wonderful to be in your company. So again, thank you all for coming to this opening ceremony of this Color, Class, and Colonialism conference. I'm very proud of the team that's worked tirelessly to make this happen. This space is amazing, and and the walls are covered with art of UB alumni and some of their students and others, but this is wonderful, and looking forward to what promises to be very exciting and stimulating 2-3 days, and looking forward to the book, which will also proceed out of these sessions. So once again, welcome to you all.
Thank you, Dr. Strawn. And he spoke about the talent in this room and the UB students, alumni, who have graced these walls with the awesome talent. And I'd like to recognize them at this time: Mr. Ben Ferguson, Mrs. Alyssa Strether, and Mr. Matthew Wildgoose, who are alumni of the university, and along with some of their students, upcoming artists, Danielle Ramin, Brianna Donaldson, Terry Lord Roll, Kylon Andrews, and Denzel Lightburn. Let's give them a rousing round of applause. And incidentally, please, these magnificent pieces on display are also on sale. So you can support our Grand Bahamians, support our Bahamian artists. Please support them. I now wish to welcome Dr. Maria Woodside Oriaki, who is the Vice President of Academic Affairs, to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Oriaki.
Thank you so much, Ms. Turnquest. I must admit that I was so excited when Mrs. Turnquest would begin because she fumbled over the word colonialism. And I thought, oh, it's going to be okay. Because I got up from 1 o'clock this morning and then I had this ungodly flight at 6 a.m. to get here. And I was reading this biography and I said, oh, Father, please be with me, that I do not mess the words, but she's made it okay if I do, and so you forgive me if I do. Dr. Strawn, first of all, let me say that I am so excited, and I too look forward to the book that will come out of this historic conference, the 50th year, that we talk about color, class, and colonialism. But let me get to the task that I have been asked to do and be quiet. You know, my daughter's in the room. She would say, Mommy, be quiet, shut up. Just do what you're supposed to do. Dr. Erin Kamugisha is a scholar of the social, political, and cultural thought of the African diaspora. He holds a doctorate in social and political thought from York University and was the 2007-2008 postdoctoral fellow in African American Studies at Northwestern University. And he has taught at the University of West Indies, Cave Hill, for over a decade. Currently, he serves as the Ruth J. Simmons Professor of African Studies at Smith College in Massachusetts. He serves on editorial boards of the following journals: The Small Axe, a journal of Caribbean criticism, Social and Economic Studies, and the Journal of West Indian Literature. He is also the co-executive director of the Race and Resistance book series with Peter Lang Publishers, an inaugural member of the Other Universals Transnational Research Collective. His primary intellectual and research interests encompass the intellectual history and the social, political, and cultural thought of the African diaspora. His latest book, Beyond Coloniality, Citizenship and Freedom in the Caribbean, Intellectual Freedom, was published by the Indiana University Press with a simultaneous edition by the University of Witwatersrand Press in 2019. He is the editor of 5 collections on Caribbean and Africana thought that include Caribbean Political Thought, The Colonial State to Caribbean Internationalization, Caribbean Political Thought, Theories of the Post-Colonial State, Caribbean Cultural Thought, From Plantation to the Diaspora, Caribbean Popular Culture, Power, Politics, and Performance, as well as The Routledge Reader in African American Rhetoric, The Longue Durée of Black Voices. He has also edited special issues of 5 journals, with a special issue of Race and Class, Caribbean Trajectory 200 Years On, to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the British abolition of the slave trade. The CLR James Journal issue on Black Canadian Thought, Small Axe 49 on Sylvia Wynter's Black Metamorphosis, the Antigua and Barbuda Review of Books, and Small Axe 64 on Caribbean Intellectual History. Dr. Kamugisha teachings include courses on Africana, social and political thought, Caribbean studies, intellectual history, and Caribbean cultural thought. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. Kamagusha to the stage.
So let me start by thanking everyone who's made this moment possible for us. I'd like to thank Ian and Livette. I'd also like to thank everyone else who's assembled here this evening. It's always incredible to speak to a Caribbean audience. There's something particularly sweet and wonderful when you're reached out to people by people who have read the ideas that you have put into the world, and their interest is in sharing community and ideas with you. It's always more meaningful for me when it's a Caribbean audience, and I'm very aware of the honor bestowed on me with this invitation to speak to you on the 50th anniversary of your country's independence. So thank you very much for this. There is one topic that I feel compelled to speak about today, and that is something called the responsibility of Caribbean intellectuals. And in speaking about this, I am going to go and draw on the greatest strengths in my research, which is Caribbean thought in pursuit of freedom, the social and political radical intelligentsia of the region, and what they have proffered to the world. And I hope that by the end of what is going to be a somewhat circuitous and a lengthy talk, that something of meaning and value has been conveyed between us. So let me begin. At the end of almost every summer, as the academic year commences, I'm drawn towards reading a short, compelling article published over 75 years ago. The article is little remembered or referenced even among the Caribbean intelligentsia, though its author, Eric Williams, will be known as long as there's a scuffling of islands and territories that we call the Caribbean. Published in the Journal of Negro Education, that formidable tome which did so much to stimulate Black intellectual production in the 20th century, the article was published in 1944 under the title Establishment of a University of the West Indies, the same year that saw the first edition of Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery. The first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Eric Williams, presents one of the most intriguing puzzles for students of the region. The first person from the Anglophone Caribbean to receive a doctorate in history from Oxford University, Williams's 1938 thesis would, on publication in America as Capitalism and Slavery, become the most debated and influential book of 20th century Caribbean history. It is hard not to feel a sense of awe at the charismatic appeal of Williams, who in 1956 founded the People's National Movement and won elections within a year, one of the most striking stories of nationalist mobilization around a new political party in the Caribbean's history. Yet simultaneously, the other side of the Williams legacy is all too well known. His authoritarian impulses, which became clear within a couple of years of independence, his later polemical writings on Caribbean history, which a Guyanese historian, Elsa Gavaya, would famously describe as new shibboleths for old. However, in Establishment of University of the West Indies, an argument published with a world war still in progress and the future of the colonial world uncertain, we can glimpse the contours of Williams at his best, the critic of the social and political deprivations caused by colonialism in the Caribbean, with the resolute conviction of the changes needed to arrest exploitation and transform the region. So Williams commences his article by noting that the West Indies has waited a long time for a university, doubtless aware of the presence of universities in Canada, Australia, and other colonies under British domination since the 19th century, and the establishment of the University of Havana in 1728. He attributes this to the status of the British West Indies as colonies of exploitation. Sugar plantations, he calls them, not colonies, which then, coupled with the absentee landlord status of the plantation elites, resulted in an almost complete disavowal of interest in establishment of institutions of higher learning in the region. But in this delay, Williams perceives an advantage, as the West Indian University will not be burdened by the mistakes of the past, and thus able to respond to the compelling demands of the pre-World War II conjuncture. Williams believes that four main features are essential in the then future West Indian University. He commences with a declaration, and I quote, "The West Indian University must serve the needs of the West Indian community," announcing federation as the singular and most important of these goals. Nor is a dream of federation limited to the Anglophone territories, as the West Indian University will have to act, according to Williams, as a rallying center for the entire Caribbean, from Cuba to French Guiana. This is incomprehensible absent a decolonizing mission, and as a result, the West Indian University must be a center for the culture of the Caribbean area, and it should aim at developing and extending our own unique culture, rather than simply facilitating the local transformation of knowledge that could be acquired overseas. Amidst the accelerating pace of production and nationalist competition, remember this is 1944, Williams positions the West Indian University as a citadel of Caribbean consciousness, an expression of the ideals and aspirations of the West Indian people in an uncertain world. Finally, Williams states that the West Indian University must be a popular university, a university of the people, an aspiration for an institution rooted in service to its community. The goal here would be to provide Caribbean solutions to Caribbean problems and to decisively contribute to the evolution of an authentic, decolonized Caribbean citizenry. There's a candor and brilliance in each of these suggestions by Williams, but they are not his most compelling single statement on higher education, which comes in his later autobiography. So published a quarter of a century later than this article, by which time Williams had spent a baker's dozen years as chief minister and later prime minister of Trinidad and Tobago, his 1969 autobiography, Inward Hunger, is boastful, iconoclastic, and filled simultaneously with glaring omissions and stunning prose. The latter is best seen in his reflections on his desire to turn down an offer to work at Fisk University, and they're recounted in the following passage. "But I had decided on my future. I would stick to the West Indies. West Indians had traditionally deserted the region. George Padmore for Africa, C.L.R. James for the absurdities of world revolution, the traditional West Indians for law and the medicine. I would cultivate the Caribbean garden from Cuba to French Guiana, and when time came for the West Indian University, as come it must, I would be prepared to play my part and to leave Washington." And this comment is quite surreal, the withering scorn towards George Padmore and C.L.R. James remarkable. This is the first mention of C.L.R. James in his autobiography. James, the school teacher, mentor, and advisor of Williams, James without which there would be no capitalism and slavery. Williams is in a hurry to deny any influence by James and Padmore and the anti-colonial movement in England, even though intellectual histories of this period place him as a fellow traveler of the International Friends of Abyssinia movement. The greatest flaw, though, in this autobiography is Williams's boastful teleology, well seen in the subtitle, The Education of a Prime Minister, in which each act logically proceeds from the former, though, as we know, his eventual return to the region was complex and full of chance. So as Williams's swan song, this account of his life is both difficult and sad, and complicates hagiographic readings of his legacy. But despite all of this, there's so much in the power of Williams's comment on the then unborn institution that would become the University of the West Indies. Rarely have the feelings of a Caribbean citizen in self-enforced exile overseas in a metropolis yearning for a return to where the truest realization of life's meaning and happiness might be found, ever been written. In our travels outward and back, we Caribbean citizens are forever journeying towards an expectation that reveals much about the inner exile that is life. University life within and outside the Caribbean is a labor of almost ineffable patience. The process of doing research, of making a significant and new contribution to the lore of human knowledge, is not one that comes easily. It involves almost a decade of training, as we know, through 3 degrees, further apprenticeships. All of these are before your work becomes proffered towards publication. And the arc of every university academic's career is different. For some, that first work is a memorable outburst, their most important contribution, before other responsibilities of life and administration shift their energies in a manner not easily replicated in their career. For many, the second work is a great contribution, created when the angst over career and writing worries have abated somewhat, giving a verve and a confidence to every sentence in what becomes their magnum opus. Some rare talents find meaningful words every day and assemble them with such a discipline and verve that it makes us all pale with envy and grief about our own shortcomings. Others dazzle sparingly but brilliantly over the years. Few, though, ever quite feel satisfied. And I say this as someone who has now published 7 edited books, 6 special issues of journal, and a book, and I'm still not satisfied. I've just begun, okay? And that's also because to fall in love with knowledge is to persistently crave more, and to feel a responsibility to something grander than yourself is a very rarely comprehended burden. So it's often lightly addressed and much unknown that there is a quiet sorrow in many of us persons who live a life dedicated to pondering the social and political dilemmas of existence in the contemporary Caribbean. The existential plight of the region raises unanswerable questions and engenders perpetual, irreconcilable tensions. What does it mean to live in countries in which the landscape and history are shadowed by genocide, chattel slavery, and indentureship? How does one reconcile the beauty of this region, the immense seductiveness of its popular culture, which transfixes people throughout the world, with the contemporary realities of poverty and the exceptional violence that afflict it? And to know that no matter the steadfastness of will to rededicate oneself over and over against the lies and injustice of colonialism, its sibling, neocolonialism, continues to grow with weight and power every generation. For me, history was not the past. It was the past, and it was also the present. I did not mind my defeat. I only minded that it had to last so long. I did not see the future, and that is perhaps as it should be, Jamaica Kincaid once had one of her characters utter. And that is the nature of the Caribbean reality that transfixes us, to not only have to fight a resurgent and stronger neocolonialism and witness the betrayals and the lethargy of our time, but to worry at Caribbean futures with no grounded expectation of that future heaven, Caribbean self-determination, freedom, happiness. One may rightly demur that it's an incredible privilege to be able to even ponder these things, though knowledge of that privilege does not diminish the complexity of the situation. By accident, talent, or luck, those given the strange chance and lot to be considered Caribbean intellectuals are faced with a series of bewildering thoughts that often revolved around the central question: what are the responsibilities of Caribbean intellectuals? Just give me a moment. So what then are the responsibilities of Caribbean intellectuals? I draw my definition, my sense of intellectual, here from figures as diverse as Antonio Gramsci, Edward Said, Claudia Jones, George Lamming, and Audre Lorde. But with the post-independence Caribbean in mind, I always return to the thought of Walter Rodney. Walter Rodney's life work has become renowned throughout the African diaspora over the last half-century and is deservingly acknowledged as the foremost radical intellectual produced by the post-independence Anglophone Caribbean. The explosion in consciousness occasioned by his barred re-entry into Jamaica in 1968 is widely considered the commencement of a period of sustained radical activity in the Anglophone Caribbean that concluded with the fall of the Grenada Revolution. His account of 1968, retold through the speeches collected in The Groundings of My Brothers, represents the first grand radical challenge to the post-independence order of the decolonizing West Indies, and a sign to the post-colonial elites that the intelligentsia would not sit still while they consolidated regime survival through new forms of domination over Caribbean working people. It is between this text and the later 1975 extended discussion in Walter Rodney Speaks that we are best able to comprehend Rodney's vision of the tasks and responsibilities of radical intellectuals. In Walter Rodney Speaks, Rodney states that, and I quote, "the major and first responsibility of the intellectuals is to struggle over ideas." Rodney's ambition here, though, is not a reproduction of the colonial class distinctions between mental and manual labor, but a recognition that the explosion of a system cannot happen by abandoning the struggle within institutions of higher learning. Rodney would invent here the term guerrilla intellectual, which he described as one whose task is to occupy the terrain of institutions not made for black people, with the ultimate aim to free the whole structure and to expropriate bourgeois knowledge for the people. His vision for a new world rested on a Pan-African socialism, the ultimate aim of which was a dismantling of structures of power of colonial dominance and its ideological corollaries. The intellectual solidarity necessary to achieve this world is dependent on a recognition of responsibility of intelligentsia at the level of awareness, responsiveness, and collaborative engagement with Africana communities. The contemporary terrain of struggle requires that colonialism is distinguished from neocolonialism as a consolidation of a new form of rule in the post-colonial Caribbean represents not just the continued march of Western imperialism, but the emergence of new forms of politics which require the use and clarification of the term neocolonialism. So for Rodney, neocolonial politics are those that derive from the consolidation of the petty bourgeoisie as a class around the state. And the appearance of this class over and over across the various Caribbean territories in regimes that should claim political orientations that are radically different, so from liberal democratic socialist to authoritarian states, leads Rodney to the declaration, and this is one of my favorite quotes from Rodney, to speak of petty bourgeois dictatorship in the English-speaking Caribbean is no play with words. His theorizing and critique of neocolonialism sought the deeper meaning behind the fictions engendered by colonialism, their reproduction so seamlessly in the post-colonial state, and the quest for a different future. The historical conjuncture is crucial as, for Rodney, neocolonial man is asking a different set of questions than the old colonial man. The momentous contemporary importance of the third row is that its people are now at the heart of the human condition. So Rodney's emphasis on the responsibility of the intellectual to the struggle over ideas, against bourgeois knowledge and towards human freedom. This is what Rodney is suggesting is the emphasis on the responsibility of intellectual. In the Caribbean, this draws us immediately towards our towering social commentary calypsonians, artists, writers, and social activists. The style and depth of engagement with this strange enterprise that is called life is what marks one as an intellectual, rather than, and is vastly more important than the work through which one spends the majority of one's waking hours. I'm choosing to group the responsibilities of Caribbean intellectuals into 7 overlapping categories for you. Unsatisfactory, perhaps, given the stakes of what I'm trying to convey, but with intimations towards a future imperfectly articulated in this reflection. So 7. First, she should throw in her lot with the most radical and discerning social movement of her time and contribute her intellectual labor towards their goal of human freedom. There is no purpose or honor in remaining removed or detached from the social justice movements of one's time, however ambivalent or contradictory their manifestations may be. Nor is a tradition of a Caribbean intelligentsia one distant from its people. The tradition insists on a grounding with the massive against the elites. Wherever one goes, and Caribbean people are perpetually mobile, you must be socially and politically conscious and active everywhere. These movements have historically been expressed as a yearning for Black and Third World liberation, a resolutely internationalist global South perspective, a steadfast commitment to twin vision and activism towards overturning a world order that produces the condition of the condemned of the earth. The contemporary movements here are reflected in the self-activity of Caribbean people rising against a class domination, which is intrinsic to capitalism, the oppression of patriarchal rule and men's violence, environmental degradation and collapse, the denials of citizenship and violence towards LGBTQ persons, anti-Black racism locally, hemispherically, and globally. In our time, this means that Caribbean feminist thought in all its manifestations lies at the forefront of contemporary Caribbean radicalism, and no radicalism worth its name can now exist without an ongoing and deep entanglement with it. The fight here remains, as it has in our post-independence times, against the Caribbean's contemporary state managers. This elite that Walter Rodney called the comprador bourgeoisie of the region, content to proffer and to perpetuate neocolonial rule through proffering Caribbean resources and lives for the consumption of metropolitan populations. This class has been responsible for a series of historical compromises that have so attenuated any possibility of Caribbean freedom in the post-independence era. The elite, whose conservatism stalled the potential of a radical nationalist movement under the People's National Movement in Trinidad in the 1950s. The middle classes, who removed their capital and fled Jamaica, hobbling Michael Manley's democratic socialism of the late 1970s, and the hostility to socialism and Black consciousness of the entire class spanning the region. These post-colonial elites are seduced by the allure of Western bourgeois citizenship, unaware of the psycho-existential price of neocolonial incorporation, whose sole commitment to Caribbean working classes is to educate them into the dependency of client politics. Under their rule, the Caribbean devolves into a series of anti-worker states, seduced and secured by client politics and a lurking, ruthless authoritarianism. That is our political moment in the Caribbean and the terrain of struggle of radical intelligentsia. That was number one. Number two, secondly, the Caribbean intellectual takes her greatest sustenance from the marvelous tradition of Caribbean thought, beyond the boundaries of Western thought and its neocolonial quizzlings. The allure of Caribbean thought is mesmerizing and renowned worldwide, with a style that shelters the hope of living in a world beyond domination. Jose Marti would call this living in a world in which humans live, not as wolves among wolves, but men among men. Sylvia Wynter would speak of a confrontation between the plantation and the plot, between those who justify and defend the system and those who challenge it. There is no tradition worth having which is not to be argued with, but there is no culture worth sheltering that does not acknowledge and honor the thought of its ancestors. And Caribbean thought gives us more conscious control over the ideas by Caribbean people over space and time in the pursuit of human freedom. Caribbean intellectual history, with its patient tracking of the history of marginalization of a region, for coloniality is always a Caribbean question, gives resonance to every movement for social justice within it because of the gravity of Caribbean history. Caribbean thought then emerges as a gathering concept, bringing together the history of islands, mainland territories, and the diaspora into reflective consideration of the conditions of Caribbean existence in this century. It contributes to the conceptualization of a style of criticism which honors but is not captivated by the past, seeks to position answers to new uncertain and unsettled futures that the Caribbean faces, and demands the enchantment of the human after Western man. Third, the Caribbean intellectual should unashamedly proclaim a love and appreciation of the Caribbean popular as a site of embodied expression of human freedom beyond colonialism and evidence of a revolution in consciousness impossible to discern in our public institutions. The Caribbean popular does not need intellectuals for its validation, as CLR James knew over 50 years ago in Havana, when he said, intellectuals should prepare the way for the abolition of the intellectuals as embodiment of culture. The terrain of the popular will always be in advance of its interpreters. Its meaning will always be elusive. Yet the Caribbean intellectual can assist the process of clearing the ideological ground under which the popular's greatest practitioners tread from conservative attack, so that its artists can concentrate less on attacks on their legitimacy, but instead on creation. The dilemma here, though, is that contemporary Caribbean state managers have been more than partially successful in their attempts to co-opt the popular. Post-colonial statecraft enacts power through its manipulation of cultural citizenship. The region has moved from a terrain of anti-colonial cultural activism to honor the little tradition of the people, to a state patronage that insists that it can serve as the authentic judge of taste and value. Caribbean popular and expressive cultures, long the scene of antagonistic relationships between the state and its subjects, will now become reconciled under the mantle of neocolonial governmentality, as can be seen in the contemporary focus on the cultural industries, the new tourism, as the salve for our aching economies. But it's here that the responsibility of the artist gains relevance and power, as Gordon Roller has so well described in his signature essay, The Calypsonian as Artists, Freedom and Responsibility. The Caribbean popular, the site of the greatest social investment by Caribbean people, represents, as Sylvia Wynter once put it, the tremendous revindication of what it means to be human, which is always put down in a bourgeois notion of man. And it is here that the revolutionary pursuit of human freedom, which forever gives it power, allure, and value. Fourth, the Caribbean intellectual yearns for the unity of the region, a form of solidarity and commonality that holds the never refuted best chance of Caribbean people living in nations that are not the prey to Western powers. Lloyd Best would sigh here and say he longs to be part of a massive Caribbean susu. Derek Walcott laments that, I quote, "One morning the Caribbean was cut up by 7 prime ministers who bought the sea in boats, who sold it at a markup to the conglomerates, and then the dogfights began in the cabinets as to who had first sold the archipelago for this chain store of islands." Derek Rudder begs his people to please remember the colonial sources of inter-island suspicion and quarrels so debilitating, even when not violent, or perhaps put differently, so violent because they are so debilitating. When he says in Rally Round the West Indies, "We already know who brought us here and who created this confusion. And so I'm begging my people, please." But it is Claudia Jones who trumps them all by diagnosing the antagonisms that would lead to the fall of the West Indian Federation in 1958, but also in undertaking the great feminist labor of facilitating Caribbean happiness through her instrumental role in the founding of the Notting Hill Carnival. Here, as with Toronto's Caribana, founded a year later in 1967, the celebration of the experience of Caribbean life and culture becomes a dramatic event recognized by the world and a signal event of global self-solidarity and intimacy in the metropolis. The Caribbean popular, through Carnival, introduces the world to an unparalleled experience of modern popular public pleasure, an enhanced capacity of feeling and happiness, which is one of the Caribbean's greatest gifts to humanity. The Caribbean Carnival, birthed in the region and expanded in diaspora, would become the most powerful expression of unity and diasporic consciousness and an unstated query regarding the instability and incapacities of other forms of regional unity. An argument for the unity of Caribbean people does not require the validation of the tomes of the economists or the technocracy of the public official. It is the lived reality of Caribbean people. The puzzle remains to give institutional form to felt conviction in the interests of Caribbean self-determination. Vision beyond tragedy is the next responsibility. That the disasters that roar so often through the Caribbean do not become an alibi for anomie, despair, a lethargy of will, or an absence of vision. The disasters the Caribbean has endured this century, from the Haitian earthquake of 2010, the greatest calamity to befall the region since slavery, to the current climate crisis and its unleashing of deadly hurricanes that have caused so much anguish throughout this region, are without doubt terrifying. But what must be resisted is the license it gives state managers to abandon the limited social democracy so hesitatingly proffered at independence and surrender to a neoliberal logic that places profits over people, commodifies the Caribbean land and sea space, and suggests there is no future for these countries except as service appendages of global capital. The reality is that vulnerability, calamity, and neocolonialism will endure in the foreseeable future. However, the next obligation of Caribbean intellectuals is to facilitate, through historical analysis and a presentation of socio-economic options, the resilience and survival of the community. How can one consume ethically in a neocolonial economy? George Lamming once mused. But in the end, we must. The grounding expectation here, it is what it always has been, to produce for human needs rather than desires manufactured from the salesman's lies, to energize a process of production that expands human creativity and produces goods and services which do not accelerate the destruction of the planet and fulfill human happiness. But what happiness can be assured if we reflect on the hard questions posed by the colonization of imagination, of desire, of colonialism's abduction in our intimate lives? But here again, Caribbean thought has an answer. George Lamming, over his life work of thought and activism spanning 7 decades, created one of the most profound bodies of work on the meaning of self-determination in the intellectual history of the Caribbean. When his immediate impulse towards fiction had been given a rest in the 1970s, his convictions as a social and political theorist of candor and brilliance led him towards an immersion in Caribbean post-colonial politics, from trade unionism in his native Barbados to the Grenada Revolution. And as a result, Lamming became the political conscience of the region. In a 1982 address on the island of Carriacou, he gave one of his finest expositions of a conundrum posed by ascetic decolonization. At this time, Lamming had just concluded coordinating the first successful conference on culture and sovereignty in Grenada, and this lecture was delivered on a trip over to Carriacou with Ngugi wa Thiong'o. In his reflections on the responsibility of a serious revolutionary writer, Lamming summons a new concept for which there is no existing curriculum, and he calls this new concept the education of feeling. The absence of this education of feeling from the curriculum of our lives is for Lamming our greatest and most dangerous omission, both in the formal educational practice and in the social revolution. The education of feeling is vital to revolutionary expression, as a central and I quote, the central and seminal value of the creative imagination is that it functions as a civilizing and a humanizing force in a process of struggle. It offers an experience through which feeling is educated, through which feeling is deepened, through which feeling can increase its capacity to accommodate a great variety of knowledge. It lies at nothing less than at the heart of my struggle for liberation. And this tiny island of Carriacou that inspired Laming to make one of his finest speeches, is renowned for its big drum ceremony to the ancestors, and is also the setting of a great novel of African diaspora feeling, experience, and desire, Paul Marshall's Praise Song for the Widow, published the same year as the tragic end of the Grenada Revolution. But it was also the birthplace of one of the parents of a theorist whose remarkable work would go beyond Laming's yearning for a decolonized aesthetic of feeling. And that theorist, of course, is Audre Lorde. And Audre Lorde's uses of the erotic essay, read in concert with Laming's education of feeling, alerts us to the depth of a colonization of feeling and desire. For Lorde, and I quote, "Every oppressor must corrupt or distort these various sources of power within the culture of the oppressed that can provide the energy for change. The capitalist and human system in which we live is predicated on the exclusion of a psychic and emotional components that are human needs, and it robs our work of erotic value, its erotic power, and life appeal and fulfillment." It is not a wonder, then, for Lorde that men instinctively recoil against the erotic, as they fear this depth too much to examine the possibilities of it within themselves. The erotic then emerges from Lorde as the life force of woman, a measure between the beginnings of our sense of self and the chaos of our strongest feelings, a creative energy empowered, a nurturer of our deepest knowledge. All of these Lorde's signal contributions and show a strange moment of commonality between two very different theorists, Laming and Lorde. Laming, who does know that in order for change to occur, we need to make the body speak feeling. And Lorde and Laming may very well agree on Laming's statement, to educate in love is really the function of the creative imagination. All of this, ethical consumption in a neocolonial economy, human erotic freedom and flourishing beyond coloniality, are impossible in a capitalist system, many would argue, and I would agree with them. For capitalism cannot fashion living communities as it is at war with the ethics of care needed for human survival on this planet, which requires centrally acknowledging the caring work performed mostly by women in society. Capital also wages war on the habitat of the human species, preeminent clearly in an age of climate change, with ever-increasing catastrophes which, as we've said, have caused so much anguish, death, and destruction for Caribbean people. This is why the transformation needed will inevitably travel a path towards a renewed socialism, made for the first time to the measure of a Caribbean consciousness. And finally, seventh, the grandest ambition of Caribbean intellectuals, to complete the process of emancipation. This, as Erna Broadbent reminds us, is a continuous process of sheltering and extending a continent of Black consciousness for ourselves, for our future, for humanity. This is a quest to honor ancestors, to become one in turn, to recognize the sacred intelligence of all living things, and to be qualified to live forever among those who have done so much to enchant human life in this region. Our ancestor, Walter Rodney, knew all of this very well. And I hesitate to move towards conclusion with a somber note, but there is this incredible and very little acknowledged passage from an interview done with Rodney, published in Race and Class in 1976. And he said the following: "I believe that normally the armed struggle is the last form of struggle upon which a people determine because it is extremely costly. Some of our finest comrades will fall, have fallen in struggle, and we don't set about to get the best of our workers and revolutionaries killed just so we can write poetry to celebrate them subsequently. When they are lost, they are lost. It's an irreparable loss and may in fact qualitatively affect the development of struggle in another phase. And even for those whom we might not remember in poetry and song, what about their lives, their decisions to risk all? As materialists, we have to say that they are risking all. If we had some other philosophical belief, we could say that they're going on to a better life. But from a materialist point of view, we say that they are prepared to end this particular material existence with no compensation except their own feeling that the society which they are recreating will hasten towards socialism. And I can barely read these words from Rodney without thinking of his tragic assassination 4 years later. This remains his great gift to us, his sacrifice in the hope that our societies would hasten towards human freedom beyond neocolonialism, his insistence that the responsibility of the intellectual is to struggle with ideas rather than to seek class power and bourgeois aggrandizement. As should be clear, my reading of a contemporary Caribbean leads me to the urgent belief that it must recreate itself anew. This transformation will mean a different political economy, political arrangements beyond elite domination, a newly reconceived Caribbean socialism, and an entirely different structure of feeling in the realm of our public and private citizens' lives. It is a quest that falters in me, as in all others who dream of a different Caribbean world. But it's a vision that we cannot live without. And it exists far beyond the dreams and despair of any individual or small group of intelligentsia, but it lies instead in the historical consciousness of struggles for liberation, the self-determination of working peoples, guided forward by the quest to preserve their communities from colonialism's destruction towards human futures. I thank you.
Okay. Let's see if I get this word right now. Colonialism, colonialism, colonialism. I got it? Thank you. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Kamugisha. And we want to open the floor now for any comments or questions that you may have for this intellectually stimulating discussion that we will definitely want to have after that wonderful, thought-provoking presentation. Let's give him another round of applause, please. Now we have a gentleman at the back. If you just raise your hand, he will come to you if you have any comments or questions.
Just to make it simpler, just.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, just
So this is a comment. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I did. Especially when you got to the part of the 7 responsibilities or, but the comment is, I struggled for the first part of your presentation because it wasn't until you got to Audre Lorde that it started to really hit for me. And it's because I was thinking, if I work my way backwards, for me there's a gap, right? And there's a gap in the sense that when I think of the word Bahamian, if we were to think of it as a jacket, it's an oversized jacket that doesn't fit me. I've never, that word means nothing to me. It means nothing. When everybody was standing for the national anthem, I refused to stand. Refuse. Because, again, my tenuous social position, where my country does not want to recognize me, means that I have to, that as simple as that may be for people in this room, it is difficult to live life. And so when I think about the word Caribbean, I have the same kind of tenuous relationship similar to the word Bahamian, because it's like, it's very abstract. It's like, what does that mean to me? And so as you walked towards the erotic, that was a place that was familiar for me because I had just been rereading the erotic. And when Audre Lorde talks about how often people, men in particular, they don't want to go to that depth, I was thinking about how, I guess, inhabiting the erotic places you in a very precarious position, right? And the tenuousness of having or feeling. You talk about the education of feeling, or yes. When you started to articulate that, it moved me because I'm reaching for something in that vicinity of what you're describing. And I'm not there fully for me to articulate it, but it's just moved. It's something. I know that you're spot on it, but I think that when you have to continuously contend with the betrayal of your own people or the petty bourgeoisie, who are your people, and they sit up in these positions, right? And they make these decisions. They toy with your life. It's a bit difficult for you to reconcile and come to grips with, okay, yes, I need to continue to do these things to move towards the goals that you talk about, right? It's a very, I know it's not supposed to be easy. Oh, sorry. Okay. I know it's not supposed to be easy, but just to have to live that every day, it is emotionally taxing, emotionally exhausting. Being willing to pay the price, right? Being willing to feel your way through the situation, being willing to address and confront of these neo-colonial structures, and then only for the people who have been intellectuals far longer than you. They've been doing this thing, most of their lives. And when you address some of these key issues, it's just almost as if everyone, or the majority, like buries their head in the sand. And it's always like, for me, I can't get over the fact that we all know, and this is a fact, we all know that this doesn't make sense.
Okay. I mean, I think I have a partial response for you, and I thank you for the kind of articulation of frustration and depth of feeling that you come to us with, because it's very important that we hear that and we understand that. Now, social change is a complex and a challenging thing. And when persons present me with the amalgam of challenges that you just said, I say a few things. I say, one, there's something to be said about solidarity around a movement or around a cause, which fundamentally changes you. So you look at Fanon, for example, the first chapter of The Wretched Affair of Concerning Violence, when he talks about the way in which the process of decolonization fundamentally transforms its actors, who are, to use his phrase, crushed with inessentiality, but become privileged actors on the stage of world history after that. You speak to anyone who's involved even in a trade union struggle that make a win or do something, you realize the ways in which that process of human solidarity and kinship actually changes their life and also allows them to understand that they're not alone in the world. So that's the first thing that I'll suggest to you. The second thing is that the great moments in which social or political change comes, when we examine them closely, have often come about for many reasons, some of them more dubious than we may think. Okay? So, in other words, we know that the British are going around up to the 1930s saying, oh God, the Caribbean native is so ignorant and he is so backward. Perhaps they can get independence in another 100 years. But we also know that it came in 30 or 40 years. And there are many intervening things that happened in between there. Yes, the 1930s labor rebellions, but also World War II and the changing power that of Europe and Britain after World War II. The US's ambivalent support for some anti-colonial movements so that it could basically foster its own new form of domination over them in the Caribbean. Sometimes progressive movements want a purity of focus. I'm not saying that you get into bed with the devil, but I'm saying that sometimes you have to be able to prepare yourself. And preparing yourselves means ideologically, historically, personally, to be able to seize the conjuncture when it occurs. When that conjuncture occurs in which a change can happen, it may not happen for long, but you have prepared yourself and everybody's listening to you or willing to listen to you for a moment because you may have been saying the same things for 10 years, but then something happens, something often very tragic, something terrible, okay? And you are the one that people are willing to listen to for a moment. And then sometimes, as Marx says, the revolution becomes the locomotive of history, okay? So I would also proffer that to you. I would lastly also say that as difficult as our times are, look back into past times and past moments. I mean, I teach W.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells, for example. Can you imagine what it was like being a black person at the end of the 19th century? Okay? You imagine the kind of nonsense that you had to put up as a black person at the end of the 19th century, okay? But you understand that you're doing this, whatever the this is that you're doing, not just for yourself or the people that you are doing it for, but to make a marker, okay, and to make a moment of possibility that others, a generation or two generations are long past when you are there, may be able to capture and move so swiftly on and get benefits that you would never have expected to get. But you hold the line and you do the work for that your generation demands. So Fanon would have said each generation has to fulfill its mission and either betray it or, I forget the whole phrase. You fulfill your mission, you find solidarity in people, you live in a certain sense of internal exile within these neocolonial places. Oh, definitely. But you find your community, whether it's here, whether it's also global, and you do the work that you have to do, okay? And you may be remembered or you may not. But none of us are going to remember past 3 generations anyway, okay? Yes. Most of us will not be, you know, I mean, past your, you may know your great-grandparents, but you probably, I don't think there's anyone in this room who definitively knows their great-great-grandparents. So the memory of you in the world is going to vanish at a particular point in time, okay? Be aware of that, yes.
Yeah, I wanted to just ask, before I hand the mic to Dion, is could you talk a little bit about, you frame your talk around the Caribbean intellectual in an age of disenchantment.
Yes.
And that disenchantment, I assume you see as a regional reality, right? So when I saw that, obviously I started thinking about disenchantment in the Bahamian context, but clearly it's happening across the region. I wonder if you could say a little bit about the nature of that disenchantment, a little bit more about what's that about from your vantage point, and then Dion.
Yeah, I would say that the main reason for the disenchantment is the fact that there is not that horizon of possibility, that future heaven that we may be struggling towards, as difficult as the journey might be. So in other words, there was a particular time in the 1970s in which people who considered themselves part of radical intelligentsia of the region understood what they were striving towards. A particular kind of Pan-African socialism was basically what they were moving towards. They wanted to move towards a particular kind of sovereignty that they thought could be possible within the region despite all the forces. I think in many cases, people are not quite sure what they want, okay? Or rather, they are not sure how to achieve what it is that they actually desire. There is no clear blueprint that is there, okay? And I think that is also part of a disenchantment. I think also part of a disenchantment is that in most cases, the major political parties of the region have shown themselves to be thoroughly bankrupt, okay? In terms of on the level of ideas, on the levels of initiatives, on the levels of basic social decency in many ways. And that is also part of a problem. But then also many of the state, that's a regional reality, but then also the state managers have been largely shown to be the same thing. So, you know, we often talk about the politicians or curse the politicians in a particular manner. I have found that the private sector and the major public sector state managers are often even worse than the politicians, because the politicians at least have a constituency that they sometimes have to perform to. But, you know, like the private sector goons and some of the major public sector servants, they don't care. You know, they'll be the first ones to say, you know, end free education, end free healthcare, balance the books, you know, and stuff. I always remember when we, ended free education, tertiary education in Barbados for about 4 years before it was reinstituted. The first public official that I remember giving a vote of confidence to it was a major player in the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Barbados, okay? Because it made sense to them, well, balance the books, you know what I mean? People got a budget, man. And people getting on with foolishness and, you know, giving people tertiary education and that kind of stuff. Well, we need to budget about that is, so I think that is part of the problem. The fact that even if you did not quite agree with everything they were saying in terms of radical movements in the past, there seemed to be a horizon to move towards. And then, of course, the major social and political movement in the Caribbean in the last 40 years, okay, which, of course, is the feminist movement, is bereft with the difficulty of the fact that there is so much work to be done by citizens of the region in order to understand and to really take on board the marvelous contributions to human freedom and Caribbean social reordering that Caribbean feminists have been doing, that they're simply not being heard, okay? And that, of course, is also part of a problem. So you have a major social movement that because of embedded patriarchy, embedded sexism in both men and women, the actual options that they're putting forward can't be conceived and can't be articulated. You know? Yes. Yeah.
I just want to thank you. But that's one of the most insightful analyses that I've ever heard in respect of our West Indian intellectuals. I want to commend you because when you began with Eric Williams, I think you encapsulated our dilemma as a people. Eric Williams, in his early days, reminds me of, Singham has a book called The Polity in the Crowd in the West Indies. And I think that you captured that because his early stage, he's revolutionary. He's part of that revolutionary movement. But when he became seduced, as you put it, by power and the trappings of the Western world, then we see a colonial mentality that was deeply embedded within him, despite his earlier intellectual prowess that awoken so many of us. You know, I just want to thank you because I think your whole analysis really is a path forwards. You show us a way forwards, not only critiquing what is wrong, but also demonstrating to us that there's a path we can follow to alleviate our dilemma as a people. And I just am honored to have been here tonight. to being in your presence. I was a little shocked when I heard your accent. Because, you know, I went to Barbados at school at Caveville in 1971. And when I was there, it was a completely different universe from the one we have now. We didn't have, you had a very progressive prime minister, but the society itself still honored the statue that just took down, Nelson, which is older than the one in England. And you didn't have such a radical and revolutionary mindset that is beginning to come from Barbados. I think it's one of the most elucidating things that I've seen that gives me hope to see what is coming out of Barbados. Your prime minister leads the way in the region. You know, on the question of reparations, your academics lead the way. And you, sir, you lead us the way into the liberation of our minds as a people. I thank you. I really want to thank you for tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yes. Yes. Thank you. I'm not in charge of the questions, so let me not butt in them.
Good afternoon. I also want to thank you for your presentation. My question was about one of the mandates that you had for Caribbean intellectuals was that they must love the Caribbean.
Love the Caribbean popular.
Okay.
Yeah.
Love the Caribbean popular. Okay. Well, that might answer my question then.
Oh, still state it, sorry. Still state it, yeah.
No, because I was thinking of like myself and my cohort, like we loved the Bahamas. You know, I think quite in like opposition to Latino's comment, like I get excited every time I hear the Bahamian national anthem. And not as a critique, right? But just as that's my reality. And I would also argue, you know, as we're talking about 50 years later, that those persons 50 years ago deeply loved the Bahamas. But I'm teaching students that don't. And so I'm wondering, how did this love, right, that we had just seem to somehow disappear? And is it that we loved the region, but we didn't love Africa? We loved the Bahamas, but we didn't love our source, right? What do you think was missing from that love that leads to a place where there now seems to be none?
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good question, very, very good. I think that two things I'll put for you. One, we cannot underestimate the extent to which neoliberalism has damaged our imaginations in the region, the ways in which the cult of individualism, which is at the center of neoliberalism, has turned certain previous assumptions about social development, about responsibility awry. So I think that critically studying and thinking about what neoliberalism has done and the cult of individualism has done in the region and how that then reflects on the way people will think about larger community structures, whether it's a village, parish, nation, is important. There was a second thing. Give me a moment. I think also, though, the second thing is that the first generation of nation builders within the region, and I'm not specifically just talking about the politicians here, in fact, I'm really not talking about the politicians here, they had so much work to do, but things were also very exciting for them, okay? There was a way of trying to rescue this vast and wonderful undertow of culture that had been denied by colonialism and bringing it into a particular kind of prominence on the stage of a nation. Everything needed to be rewritten. Curriculums needed to be changed. And for those who had the energy and the conviction to do, it was also this great moment to stand on history's page and to do certain kinds of things. Now, it goes back to my earlier comment. I think that people are not quite sure what the articulated moment and the desire actually is now, okay? And that also creates certain forms of drift, certain forms of anomie, certain forms of looking out for oneselfness. All of those kinds of things become part of it. So it's a complex issue and a complex question. Yes.
Thank you. Lived in a culture for many years where white fragility and what's the other term? With all deliberate speed, when it's not deliberate at all and there's no speed.
Yes.
And I'm looking at my current environment where people are, I guess you call them the elite that create a dependency, a dependent group. Do you see any parallelism there? I know I can't call it white fragility because it's not. So do you see anything of that sort going on in our communities?
By our communities, you mean Caribbean society specifically?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, let me start by saying I'm glad to use that phrase, with all deliberate speed. I told my students in the US that I would like them in this semester to submit an essay which was overdue with all deliberate speed. And I thought they would have got it, and no one got it. And I was there, Brown versus Board of Education people, you know, the standard phrase, submit it with all deliberate speed, okay? Yes, do it. Yeah. So, well, I think that when I'm talking about the question of elite domination in the Caribbean and educating people into the dependency, I'm particularly thinking of the way that client politics works in the Caribbean, okay? And I'm thinking in terms of the definition of client politics of the work of the great Jamaican political scientist Carl Stone and many others who've fallen his way in terms of showing the ways in which elections get manipulated within the Caribbean, the ways in which populations are actually used, the ways in which in the Caribbean, it's not like the United States in which large swathes of the population can be ignored. Because in terms of the size of our countries, we know that elections can sometimes be decided by 40 votes across 3 constituencies. Okay, I can give you examples in the Eastern Caribbean of when that's happened. But that means then that there is that interest and intention to actually arrest, okay, and to deal with any kind of social and political movement very quickly, because we never know exactly what might happen. And of course, the technology, and I'm not even talking about the more sinister forms of technology, I'm just talking about the basic computerization technology, has allowed politicians to really go into the communities and be sure about certain things and do certain kinds of work, you know, to be sure about a particular victory or not. I mean, if none of you all have spoken to someone who does polling work and actually door-to-door canvassing in a Caribbean country, you should, because I've spoken to a couple of them, and they will tell you about how, yeah, they do door-to-door canvassing, and they can look at you, and they can tell whether you're going to vote for them or not, and they basically have every single street and, you know, an analysis of it. It's absolutely amazing. They know before the results come out whether they've won or not, based on the people that they tick off, and, you know, it's incredible what they've been able to do. But what are some of the consequences of this for Caribbean society and Caribbean populations? Well, the moment that a social movement emerges, it either has to be dealt with in a particular way, which is usually co-optation, okay? So I find sometimes in Barbados, whenever I see someone speaking in a way publicly, you almost assume that they're looking to be co-opted by one of the political parties or acting as an agent for one of the political parties. But it's a terrible situation to be in, okay? You do not really expect that people are speaking with integrity about a particular moment or a particular injustice that they see. Okay? There is almost a suggestion sometimes that there is always an agenda behind it. And that's a very sad situation that we have reached in the Caribbean. Okay? But it also says something about the way that state managers have been able to drill down into our communities and control various aspects of it, because their interest is regime survival. Our interests must be something else.
Thank you. Let me introduce it this way. I remember an experiment in school that we did in chemistry in high school. It's a supersaturation experiment where we would take a glass, put water in it, put salt or sugar in it, stir it up, and sooner or later, that amount of it that couldn't be absorbed in the water would fall to the bottom. And then you'd heat it up, and that would all disappear, and you'd add more and more and more, and you get to the point where that liquid is so saturated with that salt or sugar that it's just stable. It looks like water, but it's far more than water. It's far more dense. And then you introduce a cord, a thread, something in it, and that crystal coalesces around that thread, and you see the crystal all over again. That supersaturation produces that cohesive crystal from what was densely in the liquid. And I must confess, that's what I'm thinking when I hear the presentations. It seems to me that you cannot produce a nation, a region, a people, unless you can coalesce around a core idea, to me. You can have this discussion about the Bahamas, and that's one discussion. You could have it about the Caribbean, that's another discussion. You could have it about the black diaspora, that's another discussion. You could have it about Africa. That's a totally different discussion. The results are different because of what you're focused on in the discussion. Little parenthetical thing. It's so interesting when you quote Eric Williams. He's one of my heroes. I went to COB and I went to UWI, and so I absorbed that. But it's interesting in his definition of the Caribbean, he excludes the Bahamas. It's from Cuba to French Guyana, but it doesn't include us. And so we have that same idea that there is no core. There's no coalescing around a common theme. And so when we talk about class, color class colonialism, my real question is, are we really seeing the fundamental point? Why was colonialism possible? Why was the slave trade possible? Why was there an absence of a core in Africa at that time which would have protected the whole? Why was it possible to differentiate and exploit these differences? What is there that was missing in Africa in terms of tribalism, in terms of regionalism, in terms of ethnicity, that transported over the Atlantic and is still present here? And to me, you can have all of these discussions you want to have, but until you get to that core, we're facing the same dilemma we face with the Federation, the prospect of a federation. It was obvious that before the European Union was, the Federation should have been. We were coming out of an imperial system, a colonial system, all of these countries that had their own fragilities individually, but had tremendous strength collectively, were not able to get past that absence of a core to create a federation. And we're still dealing with that today. And so I raise it as this, that's just an observation, but I raise it as this question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean,
Can I do the question first?
Yeah.
I raise it as this question. Is there any prospect of moving the region forward without a commonality, without a core? That's one question. And secondly, I watch the African continent now and the African Union moving toward a core, saying, oh, we have to stop depending on gifts and handouts from these European countries. We must have a common market, we must have a common African Union of some kind, etc. Is this an opportunity for the Caribbean, what we like to call, including the diaspora, to find an identity that we could not have found by ourselves so far, that we did not find by ourselves so far, in terms of having a common representation with the African Union in the exercise they're now involved in. And I say that because when you think about it, the European Union entered into a monetary system which nudged it toward what has now became a common currency and might conceivably one day become a political union. Is there an opportunity for the Caribbean to create a core around which we can coalesce by our common representation with the African Union? And having done that successfully, maybe decades to come, and having established an identity there, we don't repeat the same mistake we're doing now with the United Nations, where we're still different countries there. I just think there's an opportunity here.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot you put on the table, and I know this is the final question, so let me summarize a few things. One, I don't think that it always becomes productive to try to go back to the moment of the complex centuries of the slave trade to make a particular comment about the contemporary moment in Africa today. I think Rodney dealt with that question extremely well in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And one of the things I always tell people is that Africa has this idea of our governing singularity, okay, of the entire continent, is a fictitious way of understanding what was happening on the continent in the period of the of people in the over the period of the slave trade. Okay? Or to just give a very different example. Germany and France went to war 3 times from 1870 to 1945. Bismarck, World War I, World War II. We don't sit down and talk about, oh, how is it that these Europeans, and didn't they understand their white kinship, and why were they not at war with each other? Because we understand that there are political questions which led to those wars. I don't see why people find it so difficult to see that there are political questions and people across the vast terrain of the African continent are not seeing each other in the period from the 1500s to the 1800s as all basically one set of people called Africans, apart from the fact that we can go into African resistance to the slave trade, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, I'm not as interested in those sets of questions also because I'm interested more, which I think is your main intention in thinking about the contemporary moment and what we can do now. I think that, as I said, questions related to regional unity and the idea of greater regional commonality and unity in this sphere of the world are acknowledged and never refuted best way forward for Caribbean sovereignty and not having these micro neocolonial nationalities being the constant prey of Western powers. I don't want to live in the Caribbean in which we're constantly the prey or at the whims of the major blocs of the world. I want to live in a Caribbean in which Caribbean people have a sense of sovereignty and freedom, which is unimaginable in contemporary neocolonial times. This means greater functional cooperation on many levels, in terms of institutions, in terms of people, in terms of polities, on many different levels, yes. So I think that we all acknowledge that. With the African Union, let me also make one point. Africa is being continuously and continues to be consistently exploited by Western powers. So they're not relying on handouts for anybody. They're being actively exploited, okay? That's my position, and I think it's a very reasonable position. But what I would say also is that we'll have to see how these new initiatives within the Organization of African Unity actually develop. Certainly, I think the regional example and what is possible there is something that the Caribbean needs to look at and needs to join with. And there are those approaches already taking place. The question, though, is what do we make of regionalisms which are elite-driven and elite-led and whose fundamental purpose is elite aggrandizement on the African continent and also in the diaspora. Will that actually achieve freedom and sovereignty for African people on the continent or in the diaspora? I have my doubts, okay? But again, we see how things go, and sometimes these moments of linkages and solidarity, which are being led by forces who just want to deepen their market access, also open up a moment in which working people are in greater conversation with each other. Okay, so in other words, if there is a direct airline between the Eastern Caribbean and Africa, it's going to be there for certain reasons. It's not going to be there so that Pan-African activists can meet. Okay, all right? It's going to be there for trade and investment and other things. But at the same time, it may facilitate a moment in which people can actually meet and other things can take place. So, yes. Thank you very much. Before I break it, let me leave it. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll hold it. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Wow. That's all I could say. We have had a most productive and inspiring time together. And as we continue in this dialogue and debate that I am sure is happening, it's going to be a very, very interesting next 2 days, I'm sure. We start tomorrow at 9 a.m. with our first speaker, Mr. Dion, Arthur Dion Hanna Jr., and he will be speaking through the looking glass of Bahamian independence, the illusion of being the illusion of being and national identity. And then we're going to have a virtual presentation by Mrs. Gina Rogers-Seeley, who is a film director and producer, and she will be speaking on the film that she's just produced, Two-Faced Gender Inequality in the Bahamas, and that should be interesting. I think the film was already shown in Nassau, and it will be here in Grand Bahama at the Regency this Saturday. So those Grand Bahamians who would wish to go and see that, you can support her. And then finally, for the morning session, we will end the morning session with Dr. Donald McCartney, who will speak to the dilemma of black men and boys in the Bahamas, post-abolition of slavery, majority rule, and independence. So these three dynamic presentations will begin tomorrow's session. So to those of you who have not yet registered, we ask that you join us for the next 2 days. And like Darrell Miller says, a provocative conversation. All right? So we're going to end here. We're going to invite you all to enjoy the light refreshments that we have in the foyer. And we thank you, and a pleasant good evening to you all. Thank you for coming.